But thanks everybody for joining us here on this webinar today. I'm Zan from the Israel Trade Office in San Francisco, if you haven't worked with us before. And yeah, we're gonna get started on a great topic today. We could actually just advance to the next slide on the agenda. And I'll give a quick run through of how it'll go. So I think first thing I'll mention is we are recording the presentation. So we'll have this available on our YouTube channel afterwards for review. It is not the world's most viral channel, but if you are worried about your image, you can always feel free to go on or off camera at any time, suits your preference. After some quick introductions, we will have a presentation from Janice Cattano from CSSi LifeSciences. And so during that presentation, I think we would actually recommend that everybody go cameras off just for bandwidth issues, since it won't be super interactive during that first maybe 20-minute or so, 30-minute presentation. But immediately following that, we'll get into more of an open Q&A session and invite everybody to, go cameras and audio on, really get engaged and interactive about any questions you have about the material. And I think other than that, only other housekeeping items, make sure to stay muted unless you do have a question, and you can feel free to type in the chat. And yeah, we can address those all at the end. If you feel free to type in the chat, we can always address it as we go. And we let in another couple people here. And yeah, let's jump into the organizational intros. I think we'll probably first here, I'll give a quick introduction on the next slide to the economic mission. Kirtan, if you're able to go to that slide. Excellent. So yeah, if you haven't worked with us before with the Israel Economic Mission to the West Coast, maybe you've worked with our East Coast branch or others outside the US. We've got 45 offices around the world, connecting the Israeli, economy. It is largely early to growth stage tech startups with foreign markets. And so here on the West Coast, we do a lot of connection with the kind of Silicon Valley ecosystem, from tech companies to VCs, and then within healthcare. So I work primarily within healthcare and big on digital health, but also, medical device, pharma, anything within life sciences. And I think as a part of us creating these connections, we largely do form, whether it's in-person events, which have gone by the wayside a little bit these days, virtual events, introductions. I think a key component of this, in addition to just connecting directly to, let's say, the funding that you're looking for, or the hospital you've always wanted to talk to, is the education component, especially around regulation. Not as simple as it seems. And so really, really appreciative to our partners here on the call for helping to take us through, for free here on this kind of introduction, some of these topics. And I think that's a good introduction to maybe move into. I believe Jim from CSSi can take the next one.
Much, and it's a real pleasure. Thank you. And we greatly appreciate the opportunity to work with Zan and his colleagues at the Israeli Trade Association. Our goal at CSS Life Science was to partner with the Israeli Trade Association to create a seamless and expedited pathway for companies, including medical device companies in Israel, who want to enter the US market for the commercialization of their technologies. We established this program to provide various levels of support and services, many of which are free to the companies in Israel. These range from regulatory consultation, access to on-demand experts, as well as access to a clinical site network and places to call home to establish a residence in the US. Next slide. This slide here illustrates the contact information for how to reach us. It's also available through Zan's group, but we encourage and invite you to reach out to us. We have established a free FDA help desk to answer any questions that you might have. Next slide. This slide just illustrates some of the services about CSSi Life Sciences. We were founded in 2005 and based in Baltimore, Maryland, with offices in San Francisco as well as in Hyderabad, India. We're a full-service contract research organization helping to advance medical device companies from design to commercialization. Our goal is to accelerate your novel inventions through the FDA by decreasing your risk, your time, and your costs while increasing your chances for success. We have extensive experience and success with all classes and of medical devices, including just a broad experience in devices ranging from AI to various tools and instruments to very sophisticated implantable devices. We provide an on-demand medical device project team to really support your needs. Next slide. And with this, I'd like to introduce our partner, Ben Walker from the Innosphere Ventures based in Fort Collins, Colorado. Ben?
Good morning, everybody. So yes, I'm Ben Walker. I'm based in Fort Collins, Colorado. Innosphere Ventures, we have office locations in Denver, Fort Collins, and Boulder. And as you can see from my background, we're very close to the Colorado ski areas. What we do at Innosphere Ventures is we help clients with the commercialization path, introduction to investors, investor relations. And we also have access within our own organization to office space and lab space. And then we have contacts within the area for other office and lab space. We would love to meet you and potentially work with you moving forward. With that, I would like to introduce you to Janice Cattano from CSSi LifeSciences. She is someone who has successfully worked with many of my clients, and I'd like to introduce her to have her speak today. Janice?
Thank you, Ben. Can you advance the next slide, please? So it's a pleasure to speak with all of you this morning. And what I'll be discussing is the US FDA regulatory pathway for medical devices. And this is handled through the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. It's called CDRH. So to begin, it's really essential to understand, how does the FDA define a medical device? And they define it as any healthcare product that does not achieve its principal intended purpose through a chemical or biological mechanism of action and is not systemically metabolized. If it is, it becomes a drug. Next slide, please. So as you can see from the photo, devices range from those that are really simple to those that are extremely complex. The complexity of the device does not determine how it's classified. A device is assigned to one of three classes based on the risk that it poses either to the patient or the end user, and therefore the level of controls necessary to provide a reasonable assurance that it's going to be safe and effective. And we'll get into those in a moment. So as the device class increases, so do the regulatory controls. Next slide, please. So we'll start with class 1. Class 1 devices are generally the lowest risk of harm. They typically only require general controls. And a general control refers to things like product adulteration, misbranding, records, reports, the fact that you need to have your company registered and list the devices, and we'll get into the very specifics of it. Class 2 devices follow the pre-market notification or the 510K pathway, and they require both general and special controls. So special controls are device specific, and it depends upon the product code and CFR that your product is categorized under. And these would include things like performance standards. What do you need to have as far as your submission? Labeling requirements, pre-market data requirements, post-market surveillance. So again, it becomes more of a product category specific. The de novo pathway is an alternative 510 pathway. And again, I'll get into that a little bit later. And class 3 devices, these are devices that sustain or support life. They're implanted, or they present the potential for an unreasonable risk of illness or injury. These have the most stringent controls, and they follow a pre-market approval of the PMA pathway. Next slide, please. Class 1. So these are your low to moderate risk, and about half of the devices in the US are class 1 devices. The majority are pre-market notification 510K exempt. So in other words, they don't require a 510K. However, that's not always the case. And let me start by saying, with devices, everything's gray zone. In drugs, it's a very clearly defined pathways, what you need to do, how they're handled. With devices, it's a lot more gray. So everything has generally in front of it. So generally class 1s are 510K exempt. So right now, everyone's obviously very conscious of the pandemic that's going on. There's been a surge in interest in viral transport medium kits. These are the collection kits where you take the swab, you put it into the collection tube, and it's got the viral transport media within it. These are class 1, but they are not 510K exempt, so they require a 510K. Typically, generally, clinical trials are not required for class 1 devices. There are some good manufacturing requirements, practice requirements associated with these products. Again, it varies depending upon the product code. They can go everything from nothing to needing document control and recall reporting to a full GMP. So as you can see from the examples that I listed here, the devices range from very simple IV poles to complex things such as a mass spectrometer. And I put mass spectrometry up there for a reason, because that was recently downgraded from a class 2 device to a class 1. So things not only are not always black and white, but things change. And so you have to stay on top of the regulations. So what happened with these mass spectrometers and IVDs and things of that nature? So it used to be that in vitro diagnostics, which were the test kit as well as the reader, were all class 2s. And now what they've done is they've separated it so that the reader is a class 1, but the collection kit and the part that has the reagents is still a class 2. If we look at a thermometer, if a thermometer is simply claiming to measure temperature, it's a class 1 device. It measures temperature. Your temperature is 97.6. But if you now take that thermometer and you put a claim on it and you say it's a way to monitor fertility status, you've now added a claim, and that simple thermometer is now moved into the class 2 category. So let's talk about class 2. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, thank you. All right. So class 2 devices are moderate risk devices. The regulatory pathway is pre-market notification 510K. So for a 510K, a device must be substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device. That's your predicate. What does it mean to be substantially equivalent? So the subject device, the one that you're providing, has to have the same intended use as the predicate and comparable technological characteristics. Now, if the technologies are different, but the FDA has cleared other devices with comparable technologies, those can become the reference predicates. You really have to line up your indications for use. That's the important thing. Now, this is another piece that companies, especially new to the medical device regulatory environment in the FDA, are not familiar with. But in the regulatory world in the US, the objective is to show the FDA that you're exactly the same as everything else that they've cleared before. The FDA doesn't like new and different. It makes them very nervous. So your goal is to find a predicate with an indication for use that's going to meet your marketing needs. And as a company, you need to decide how important is it to have a specific claim versus your speed to market. And the reason I say that is, once your product is cleared, clinicians can start using your product in any manner that they deem appropriate. They can publish their findings. They can talk about their findings. They can present it at conferences. And this is an easy way to expand your usage. Once you start getting this kind of data, you can also use your first cleared 510K as your predicate. You add your additional testing on, and you start to expand your intended use using yourself as a predicate. So there's lots of ways to maneuver the system. The other thing that people tend to get nervous about is how we compare the products for the predicate. Again, we're looking for something to line up. It's substantially equivalent. You don't have to be better than the same. So an easy reference would be, I would take a pen and a computer, that does word processing, your Word document, and say they're substantially equivalent. because they both are intended to put words onto paper. Maybe the technologies aren't exactly the same, but the bottom line is they both put words on the paper. So when you see your computer and go, wait a minute, how can you compare my computer to a pen? It's not insulting. It's the game. It's the goal of how do we show it to the FDA to get you onto the market. Okay, next slide, please. So the majority of Class 2 medical devices require benchtop testing. And what kind of benchtop testing is needed? Well, it really depends upon the device. So if it's a product that comes in contact with the patient in some manner, then you're going to need biocompatibility testing. If there's if the device is powered, you're going to need electrical safety standards to be met. If there's software validation, Bluetooth connectivity, now you got to get into cybersecurity testing. If it's sterilized, we've got to have sterilization testing, package integrity testing, shelf life testing might be needed depending upon what the product is. The majority of devices require ship testing to make sure that the end user gets the product without damage. And the ship test, I call it shake and bake. They expose it to temperature extremes, they shake it, they throw it, they make sure that when you open it up, it looks the same way that it was before. And even though this sounds like, oh, well, that's a big, easy one, that's the least one, it's not going to make a big problem. Actually, we've seen the biggest challenges sometimes encountered with ship testing. So we encourage companies, when you're working on your device design, work on your packaging in parallel, because we want to make sure that the device packaging holds it in the manner that you want. It doesn't come out of the trays during shipment. And this is also going to impact on your sterilization, because how many of these are going to go into a shelf box? How many shelf boxes are going to go into a shipper? Because that's going to affect your sterilization and your sampling from that as well. So all pieces tie together, and that's where it's important to look at it. Now, clinical trials are typically not required, again, for Class 2, but that's not an absolute. There are a number of situations where clinical trials are required, but the clinical trials are unlike the pharmaceutical clinical trials that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which are your phase 1, your phase 2, your phase 3 tests. Here it's typically either one, or if it's a PMA, you'll need a pilot and a pivotal trial to run them. But even with those, typically they're smaller, although again, depending upon what the device is, they can run big. So there's no absolutes in it. Now, human factors testing, if the product's going to be used by a patient, it may require human factors testing. So what does that mean? So in the picture here, I show an example of a CPAP unit. You would need to do testing for this unit, human factors, which would be giving the patient, the end user, the instruction for use. And you want to be sure that those instructions for use are understandable and that the patients can follow them clearly. The switches that they're going to be turning on are easy to use. They don't get stuck. The displays, they're easy to read, they're understandable, etc. So your human factors testing is looking at those parts of the device that can be fixed with your design changes. So you've now completed your benchtop testing. You've completed clinicals if they were required. You've done your human factors if it's required. You've put together your entire package, and you now submit it to the FDA. The FDA by law must render a decision in 90 days. However, if the FDA comes back and says, we have some questions or we want to request more information, they stop the clock. And they stop the clock until they receive that information and it satisfies their question, and then they'll resume the clock ticking. So in real time, it could take 5 to 6 months, just so that you're aware. If it goes through smooth without stopping the clock, they have to have it in 90 days. Next slide, please. So what happens if you've got a moderate risk device and there's no predicate, there's no clear-cut predicate? It used to be a much more complicated process, but what's happened is the FDA has created a 510(k) de novo pathway. So this is basically where you're saying this is low to moderate risk device, and there's nothing substantially equivalent to it out there. And what this does is this allows you to file it under this de novo pathway, and the FDA will assign a new product code to it, and they'll have to create special controls appropriate for this new product code. This is a lot more costly than the traditional 510K pathway because it requires more data, and typically it will require some clinical trials, but you are now establishing the unique claims and indications for use based on what you're submitting. And it does sometimes give you some price premium, but again, there's a cost to this. Next slide, please. So remember I said nothing's very much black and white in the world of devices. If it is, if you've got a device and it's a clear predicate, it's a clear testing pathway, you know, there's no questions whatsoever, you submit your 510K and you go right to it. But if you've got questions, the FDA has put together a situation, what's called pre-sub or a Q meeting, and you can get the FDA's feedback prior to your submission. So let's say there's a predicate and it's a stretch. We want to confirm that they would accept this as your predicate, or we want to confirm that that the benchtop testing is all that's going to be required. Or if we do know that clinical testing is going to be required, you submit your protocol synopsis with endpoints, and you confirm that this is in alignment with the FDA's requirements. So what you do is you submit a meeting request to the FDA with specific questions, and you only provide enough information in the package so that the FDA can answer your questions. It's not an IND. It's not a data dump. Because it's important to remember, you're just asking the FDA these specific questions. The FDA is not your regulatory consultant. And if you use them as that, they'll pretty much not answer your questions. It's just a way to confirm your strategies in alignment with the FDA's opinions. And typically these are, do you agree that? And they'll say, yes, we agree, or no, we do not agree, and they'll give you the reasons. Now you can have strictly a written correspondence, which we don't recommend, or you can request a meeting with the FDA. And typically pre-coronavirus, pre-COVID, we would always request a face-to-face. However, or you can request a conference. However, right now, there's only teleconferences that are being granted. So what happens is you put in your meeting request, you request a meeting 70 to 75 days after you put in your request, and then the FDA will provide you a written response to all of your questions 2 to 5 days before the meeting. And you look at those responses. If they are in agreement with all of your questions, you know, yes, we agree with this, yes, we agree with this, then you say, thank you very much, and you're done. If they have, let's say, 2 questions where they're not in agreement, then you hold your face-to-face meeting, and you only need to discuss those because you don't want to talk the FDA out of the response they gave you to the others. So it's just to go and have those meetings. If we weren't in the COVID situation, we would highly encourage the face-to-face. And that's because during those meetings, you can read the body language of the FDA on how they're responding to you. And also it's after the meeting is over, there's some nice interaction, but you know, we've had some of these teleconferences and they work just fine. And there's no cost, no filing cost to the FDA to hold these meetings. Next slide, please. So we're frequently asked, how long will it take to get my class 2 product from ideation through to commercialization? And of course, it really depends upon how long it takes you to get the design freeze, how long it takes to get all of your testing done. But typically, the time frame is a 9 to 18 months window. That's typically how long most of them take to happen. As you can see from this graphic here, the phase 1, 2, 3, if you notice, they're not in succession, they're not sequentially, but they're parallel. So you can start one while the other one is running. So, and again, it just depends upon how much overlap it is, how much development time it takes till you get into that beta units, etc. And we highly recommend involving your regulatory consultants in the entire device development phase. Why? Because while you're developing these products, you're deciding on your bill of materials. What products are going to go into designing those medical devices? That's very critical as far as what needs to go into it. So a lot of input is given onto material selection. What's needed for it? How is it? What is the testing being done? We talked earlier about biocompatibility and cytotoxicity. Cytotoxicity is a component of biocompatibility. There's multiple ones, and we've had clients come to us afterwards saying, "Well, we did all of this. We had the test, and we failed cytotoxicity. What should we do now?" Well, once you've done the test, you've got to report that you failed it. It's reportable. We'll guide you as to which cytotoxicity testing should be performed, how it should be performed. And so it could take away some issues later. Even as far as asking the FDA questions in the pre-sub, well, it's really simple. It's free. We're just going to submit our questions and ask the FDA. They either use them as a consultant or they don't phrase the question in a manner that's regulatory ease. Regulatory talk is a little different than the English language. And so there's an unspoken subtlety to how questions are asked and the response that the FDA responds back. And that will help guide your pieces. So just we've been called in to clean up things after the fact. Okay, next slide, please. So what happens if you've got a medical device that's a class 2, let's say, and it's got a drug inside of it? So that would make it a drug device combination product. And the definition of that is when you have 2 or more different types of medical device products. And those could be a drug, a biologic, or a device. You need to have 2 or more of those within it to become a drug device. And the FDA has defined 9 different types of drug device combinations, and I'm not going to get into those. They get complicated. And the lead reviewer is going to be determined by the primary action of the combination device. And it'll either be through CDER, CBER, or CDRH. And the lead organization will determine what are the centers need to be involved with regulatory oversight. So let's assume that you've got a drug device combination and CDER is the lead reviewer. They'll make sure that CDRH has looked at the device itself and that all the pre-market reviews are done appropriately. Okay, next slide, please. So now we get into, and I'll keep this on a pretty high level, class 3, which is your pre-market approval. And just because you're going to hear these things, when you have a class 2 device, those devices are cleared by the FDA. A class 3 device are approved by the FDA. So that's your difference. So if you read about something that says this device was cleared, you know it was under a class 2. If it was approved, you're in PMA territory. So as we said, these are high-risk devices. They sustain or support life. They present the potential for unreasonable risk or illness or injury. You've got things like cardiac stents, pacemakers, and IVDs. And you think, IVD? So I don't know if you're aware of something, and I'll give you an example of one of these. Exact Sciences in the US, they have an in vitro diagnostic kit, which uses a stool specimen to say whether you have a high chance of having colon cancer or not. And then that'll determine whether or not you should have a colonoscopy to follow up. That's high risk because if they miss it, then that puts the patient into a unreasonable risk of illness or injury. And so those types of in vitro diagnostics are considered class 3. There's other class 3 IVDs that are class 2. So again, you can't just look at a general category and make a determination. Oh, if it's an IVD, it must be based on its indication for use. All class 3 require formal clinical trials. They don't really care if there's a predicate for them or not. If there is a similar product, it's probably a PMA. And you're going to be comparing the performance of your device to the gold standard or the standard of care. Many of them need an IVD, an IDE but that's not 100%. Again, an IVD doesn't need an IDE or an investigational drug exemption. It just depends upon what device is being looked at. So a PMA package, this one is very similar to the drug world. You have to have a very extensive package. It goes into the CMC, your manufacturing processes, all your controls, there's clinicals, a full QMS, there may be inspections before it's approved. So this is a very timely and expensive regulatory pathway. Next slide, please. Small business entities. So there's a cost for filing in each of these regulatory pathways. And a way to get a lower filing fee for medical devices is through setting yourself as a small business entity. And that's defined as gross sales receipts of less than $100 million. And this applies not just to US firms, this is for US as well as foreign entities. So the FDA has guidances as to what types of tax documents have to be submitted to prove that you have your gross receipts of less than 100 million. PMA filings are free, your first one, if your gross sales are less than $30 million. Now, what's really critical is the FDA works on a fiscal year that starts October 1 and ends September 30th. So if you're planning to file, say in December, you don't want to set up your small business entity because that has to be set up yearly. So you don't want to file your small business entity until you're within the same fiscal year as the FDA. So you would file it October 1 of that year so that you can have your submission. So how does this change your rates? Next slide, please. So for a 510K, your standard filing fees, this is the October 1, so it just went into effect a couple of weeks ago, is a little over $12,000. With a small business entity, you drop to about $3,000. A PMA, $365,000, drops down to about $91,000. And your de novo, which is almost $110,000, drops to $27,000. So these are substantial savings. Next slide, please. So, website. Why am I putting up website? When you're getting ready to file, when you file your submission for whatever it is, or even a pre-submission meeting, the FDA, like all of us, is going to say, who are these people? And they're going to Google you, and they're going to go into your website. Your website is considered labeling. Labeling is what you put in your product container, what you put inside your product, your instructions for use, what your marketing material, and your website. And trust me, they will look at it. You cannot make any claims on your website until you have gone through the regulatory process, or the FDA frowns on it very dramatically and will take action. We have a number of clients that we are familiar with that have not listened to this advice, and they are in big trouble. You cannot make a claim prior to what is approved or cleared by the FDA. However, what can you say? You can say under development, currently investigating, that you can couch things, but you got to be sure that it's couched. We had one potential client. They came to us and they said, oh, and we looked at their website and we're like, whoa, you are making claims, that we're not sure you're ever going to be able to substantiate. The FDA will never clear. And their answer to us was, oh, it's fine. Everybody else is doing it. And we said, it doesn't make it fine because everybody else is doing it. And then about 6 months later, I read about the FDA taking action against 9 different firms specifically about that. So that was really simple. The FDA just found all of them at one point. Okay, next slide, please. So what's a strategic roadmap for success? We like to start at the end and then we reverse engineer it. So tell us, what is it you would like to say? What is the indication for use and claim you would like to say? All right, then we're going to back it up from there. We're going to figure out how we're going to get there. And it may take a bunch of steps to get there, where we start with a lower claim, if that's acceptable, And then we predicate against yourself to get to the claim. We might be able to get to that claim right away. You know, what is it? What's the problem that this device is solving? Because that's going to get into our design history files, and what are the inputs and what are the outputs that are important for this product? Where do you want this product marketed? Are you only going after the US? Are you only going after Europe or Asia? Because that's going to tie into your product design. If a company says, I'm never leaving the US, then they only have to meet US requirements. If a company says, I want to start here, but then I want to expand, we've got to figure out what's the best regulatory pathway. Where do people like to see it first? And that's also going to dictate what testing standards have to be met. How do you design your electrical? All sorts of different aspects. So we want to know, where do you want to end up, so we know how to get you there. Okay, next slide, please. So you've gone through, you've received your FDA clearance, you've received your FDA approval. What do we got to do now? What you have to do now is you have to have establishment registration. So every device manufacturer has to be listed with the US FDA. There's an annual registration fee, and that's irrelevant of whether you're a small business entity or not. And again, you must pay this fee every fiscal year, October 1st. Once you're listed as a device manufacturer with the US FDA, then all your devices get listed under their website. So you just link in, as your products get cleared or approved, you link them into your registration registration. So there's no fee. It's covered under your establishment fee, and there's no limitation to how many devices you can list under it. Next slide. I'm only going to talk about this very briefly, but quality management systems. So unlike the EU and outside of the US, in the US, you don't have to have your full proof of quality management system at the time of filing, but you need it to commercialize. So they don't require proof when you file your registration, but they're assuming that you're compliant with it throughout your process. So what does that mean? It means that you're designing the product and going to be manufacturing the product following quality management system guidelines. And so that's document control, design history files. So you want to make sure that those essential parts of your quality management system are in place and that you're following them through, because the FDA can do a random inspection at any time they want later on. Okay, next slide, please. So what's in a quality management system? And there's two of them. In the US, it's 21 CFR 820. Everywhere else in the world, it's ISO 13485. And this system basically refers to your SOPs, your forms, and your work instructions to handle everything, as I said, from document management through design controls, your production controls, your suppliers, how you're handling them and auditing them, your facilities, and then later on for how you're going to handle the release of the products, complaint, your corrective and preventive actions, and your labeling. And I believe that we will be having a seminar at some point later on where we will go really into depth as to what is required for a quality management system. Next slide. So thank you. And I'd like to turn the program back over to Zan and open up for discussion.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you so much, Janice. Yeah, really incredible overview. And then, also specific examples there of things to watch out for. So really appreciate that for us. And I think for everybody on the call, you can go ahead and start thinking of some questions that you have for Janice. I see one has come in the chat, but before we actually, we'll jump into the Q&A right now, so we can even cut the slide presentation and folks can, you can go cameras or audio on. Let's bring in Michael Hassman from scPharmaceuticals, SVP of operations, and a lot of experience with this. I believe also you all have worked with specifically Israeli device manufacturers. Yeah, so maybe I'll pass it to Mike for an introduction of himself and the company, and after that we can get into some Q&A.
Thanks, Ann. Yeah, so again, my name is Mike Hassman. I work for scPharmaceuticals. Right now, we have a combination product that is under review by the FDA, and we are working with an Israeli division of West Pharmaceuticals for the device component of that combination product, and have met with and done different collaborations with different Israeli companies in the past. I see some familiar faces out there too, some familiar names, so that's good. My background has been in manufacturing and product development for medical devices. The last 15 years is really focused on drug delivery devices, and again have a product under review right now at the FDA.
And Zan, is it okay? I see we've got one question, if I can just address this. So the question is, if a company is ISO 13485 certified, can it be assumed they're compliant with 21 CFR 820? There's some subtle differences between the two, and there's some different forms and requirements. So no, you need to be sure. And what we do is we work with companies and we make a system, a QMS system that has the requirements that meet the 820 as well as the 13485. So again, there's not a huge number of differences, but there are enough that you need to be able to have those different forms and the different procedures in there to be compliant with each one and to pass the audits.
Okay. Perfect, thanks. Yeah, and I think maybe for Mike, just to start more generally, and then we can get into specific issues or take more questions. But yeah, any tips that you have generally for folks, I guess with your experience working with the FDA, and you can go specifically to for Israeli companies, but any top tips you can think of?
Sure. I think, first and foremost, I think, like this seminar here, understanding what the FDA requirements, understanding how they work is very important. I think the other thing is, if you're partnering with a company in the US with your product, I think it's just very important. We all know any partnership, collaboration, it should be set up as a win-win scenario. And it's important to partner with someone who has the same objectives that you do, but also I'd say on top of that, also the same priorities. Bigger companies have maybe a lot of programs going on. The program for you might be a top priority for the life of your company. It might be a lower priority for a bigger company. So it's important, I think, objective alignment, but also prioritization alignment is key.
Nice. Yeah, I think we had some back and forth on this before, but are there any pitfalls that you've seen happen with that looking for partnership to get in?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is again, besides aligning in priorities and in objectives, having a clear scope of the project. I think that is important to do, and important to be upfront. Status of development. We can oversell something and that never comes out good in the end when it comes time to execution. So being transparent about that, the scope of the project you're looking for, as well as the current status of development. Just being transparent with the partnership as possible.
Perfect. And this might seem like a leading question to ask a cultural one right afterwards, but are there any issues that you've seen kind of maybe predictable or common issues US-Israeli cultural dynamics?
Sure. I think in general there's no real big issues at all. But I would say one thing to be conscious of is the US is a big country, and it's a diverse country. Each region is a little different from one another. And I think some regions are more knowledgeable about the Israeli culture, have more exposure to Israeli culture. So I think going in, assessing where are we on this scale, and doing some education then, if need be, on just simple things like holidays and the work week. I mean, just something as simple as that. There's many U.S. companies might not even realize that Friday is not a working day. So it's important not to assume these things and kind of assess and work through it as you move forward.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll definitely invite anybody else that if you want to jump in, feel free to, turn the camera on or type something in. Oh, new scene from Nevada. I'll read it out here and see what we got. But new scene from the Nevada Innovation Center is exploring a medical partnership between hospital groups and Israeli Innovation Authority, such as they have in place with the Mayo Clinic, Hartford Healthcare, Thomas Jefferson University. So those partnerships relate to launching pilot programs for medical devices and/or software. Are there regulatory requirements for pilot projects such as these before public deployment? I don't know if either Janice or Mike have a thought on that one.
Yeah, I think from a regulatory side, I'm going to have to defer to Janice on that one.
And again, it depends upon what your pilot program is. So if your pilot program is your testing program, then no, you're doing it as a research use type of product. And so as long as if it needs an IDE, you would have to have an IDE. But if it's just to gain it could be a proof of concept trial, it could be your benchtop testing, and not your bench, it could be your testing to support the submission, then no, you don't have to. You have to just be sure that you've got the labeling right. You've got to be really careful in these with what you're labeling, because that will shut down a trial also really fast if it's not labeled properly.
Nice. You want to expand on anything you've seen?
Appreciate it. Yeah, and that's good, Zen. Thank you. And thanks, Janice.
You're welcome. Anything else?
So I would like to pop up on a question. This is Zvika Bakarim from Israel, the CEO of a company called Picodia. I think this question goes to Janice. It's okay, Zan?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Great. So first of all, thank you for inviting me in the last minute, but inviting me. I think it was very interesting. So Janice, I want to ask you a question about, you mentioned about, put away from your website anything that refer to innovation, and
Couch it. Couch what you say. You can refer to all of it in development, currently being investigated. Couch your words.
Yeah, I understand. But I'm going to take it for the next step, not only the website. Assuming that we have on our hand a system or device or a product that essentially have additional features where you're struggling finding the substantial equivalent for a 510K. Would you know that to recommend, I know it's a general question, but the answer should be very specific at the end for every case, but have you been aware of a situation where you are downgrading your device in order to avoid the de novo path and have a 510K, approval at the first stage, even though that you know that you are losing some of the advantages that your device has, just to avoid the de novo, which probably is a longer path, more complicated in a way? Is this a common practice? You said the FDA doesn't like new things. So are we trying to satisfy the FDA in a much more effort way that trying to, present our device or solution as an innovative one with all the features and advantages that we believe that we have in it?
Yep. We have this discussion with clients all the time. But my product does all these wonderful things. Well, now some of them they're wonderful things, move them into PMA territory. Other times it's definitely a de novo. And you just saw from the filing costs, forget the development work. That's got a substantial difference. So we have very frank conversations with them about what's more important to you. Is it more important to get in the market, or is it more important to be tied into that specific claim? So we were working with a company, and they said to us, listen, we're like them, and we want to be able to make those same claims. And they had these very, very specific claims that they claimed that the competitor was making. Well, we pulled it all up. And when I showed them that the actual labeling of their competitor, because I said, everybody knows it has this property. And I showed up the claims and I said, no, it has nothing in the filing. What they have is very bland in their labeling. But what they've done is they have Dr. A, and he uses the device and he says, you know what I found when I used it in these patients, I saw this, this, and this, and they published. So what we have people do is you even in your website, you have your approved product, and then you have your references. And in your references, you can put in any scientific papers that are in the public domain. You are just putting in papers. So if you get people you get key opinion leaders, especially, to use the device once it's cleared, how they used it, publish it, talk about it at symposiums. That then starts, and that's actually how you get things changed as far as the guidelines in America, is they start to see over and over and over, these physician groups and key opinion leaders are using it this way. That starts changing even guidances. So go for the lowest hanging fruit, get some sales, get the usage out there. You can try and then continue to expand your claims. Sometimes you're not going to be able to, but you've got to weigh from a business perspective what's most important. Mike, I don't know if you have anything from a U.S. firm's perspective on that one.
Consistent with yours. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just had one for Mike or also could be for Janice, but yeah, recommend your best practices, let's say, for getting products through customs prior to commercialization.
Yeah, good question. It seems so simple, but it's never simple. There's several things I'd say in general. It's good to have a customs broker, a company working for you that has power of attorney to act on your behalf as you're trying to get product through customs. We found that that's very important, very helpful to get it through in a timely manner. We use UPS supply chain services, and they've done a great job on that. But I guess the other key is consistent information. Obviously, information has to be correct, the right harmonized codes, tariff codes, things like that on the commercial invoice. But the other thing is consistent information. You're going to have a lot of documentation in that packet between the commercial invoice, packing slips, etc. The more you can keep everything consistent from the description of what you're sending through, obviously the part numbers and things, just consistent, it'll raise less questions. And I think maybe the last thing is avoiding the use of the word samples. Samples has a certain meaning. A lot of times samples are what's given to a doctor for use and things like that. Units for engineering evaluation, things like that, a much better way to describe something if that's truly the case. But if you're saying it's an engineering sample, just that term sample can raise some red flags.
Very nice advice there. It definitely helps. Let's see. I probably got maybe only one more from my side, and then yeah, anybody can feel free to jump in as we finish in the next few minutes. But I think in my experience working with a lot of digital-focused startups from Israel around healthcare, there's maybe a perceived difference, let's say, around like a digital health versus a physical medical device. Looking back at the definition from Janice, right? If it doesn't have a chemical process in the body, then it's a device. But do you have either of you to add on, I think some of the new regulation, which I did not, Saba did not specialize in, around maybe it's AI or machine learning, or these kind of the digital regulations that let one company have the company be approved rather than a specific device, and then continue to put out new devices under the existing approval. Any thoughts about digital changes?
So what you'll find with the FDA, at least with the medical devices, it's evolving. Guidances are constantly coming out. 10 years ago, there was no AI, and now it's a whole new area of medical devices, and they're expanding the guidances for it. So it's a matter of working with somebody in regulatory and staying current with it and figuring out where that specific AI, where it fits in, or is it a component of the actual device? Devices seem simple, but they're actually they're interesting. They're a little bit more complex. And drugs are actually the easy one. If you do your preclinical, your non-clinical, phase 1, 2, 3, boom, you're done. As long as you have efficacy and safety. Devices are creativity challenge.
Yeah, I would agree, especially with connected devices and all the opportunities that creates in different applications, etc. It's definitely something you have to be careful of, and again, stay close with the FDA to make sure you're not stepping out of bounds there.
Excellent, excellent. Well, yeah, I think that sums up pretty well for today's topic. Phil, if you have a last second question, oh, nice, Shahar. So yeah, if relevant, a legitimate way to sell a wellness product to hospitals in the U.S. So maybe wellness CPT codes for reimbursement. Any experience with that?
That one, that would be something our VP of Regulatory probably could address for you. And again, it also depends upon, remember, if you're selling any medical device into a hospital, if it's got power, you've got a lot of standards that you're going to have to meet, EMC, electrical standards, and it has to be able to work in a hospital environment. So it really depends upon what the product is, what's going to be required. But the regulatory pathway and the CPT codes are also different.
Yeah, I would say, I'm not an expert in reimbursement at all, but given some past experience, sometimes, the pathway to reimbursement is longer, more challenging than the pathway to regulatory approval. So important to have a strategy up front, understanding how you're going to move through it as part of the overall program.
Perfect. Well, nice. I think that one's a good question among many, and hopefully we get into similar topics in our future webinars. So this is a series, and there will be more. So stay tuned, everybody, for future announcements. And also, if there is a specific topic that you want to see, send me an email. We've also got contact info from others on the slides here. If you didn't get anything, feel free to send me an email. I'll be willing to email intro you to anybody from the presentation side of the discussion here. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining in.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You know it. Take care, everybody. See you next time.